Hello everyone, welcome to Crystal Diaries. This is another video of a series of videos relating to law of contracts in India. This is the part 2 of free consent in contract. So in part 1, if you can check on my playlist, I have actually explained about what is free consent, where it has been defined, and what is the importance of free consent, and what happens if the consent is not free in a contract. So you can check that. And in this video, we are going to read about the various elements that makes a free consent not so free. But before that, please bring your Barrett, a notebook and a pen so that we can read the Barrett simultaneously and we can note down every important point whatever we discuss here. So let us begin. So as we have read in the previous video about free consent, let us first summarize and let us first revise whatever we read in the previous video. So section 14 had defined free consent. It said that consent is said to be free when it is not caused by, first, coercion as defined in section 15, or second, undue influence as defined in section 16, or fraud as defined in section 17, or misrepresentation as defined in section 18, or fifth, mistake subject to provisions of sections 20, 21 and 22. So we in the previous video also learned that in case the consent is not free in a contract, it becomes void or voidable depending on the circumstances. And now we are going to understand these circumstances in detail. So let us start with coercion. So coercion has been defined in section 15 of the Contract Act. So section 15 says that coercion is the committing or threatening to commit any act forbidden by the Indian Penal Code, or the unlawful detaining or threatening to detain any property to the prejudice of any person whatever, with the intention of causing any person enter into an agreement. So what happens here that you are threatening a person, you are forcing a person to get into a contract. That if they do not get into a contract, then you are going to do something very adverse to them, which is forbidden under the IPC or which is prejudice to them. So also it is important to note that it is actually not important whether the IPC is or is not in force in the place where the coercion is employed. So if you are doing any kind of act or omission that is punishable under IPC, and you are forcing a person to get into a contract by doing such act or omission, then you are actually coercing a person. Now a question comes that if a person threats to commit suicide, will that amount to coercion? Yes, it would. It was held in the case of Chikham Amiraju versus Shamma that threat to commit suicide amounts to coercion. In this case, the husband was actually threatening to the wife to get into a contract, otherwise he would commit suicide. And the court held that threat to commit suicide amounts to coercion, because you have seen in IPC that attempt to suicide is also an offense. But another question also rises, that is a threat to prosecute a person also amount to coercion? Well, that depends. That if in actual that person is liable to prosecution and the person is threatening to prosecute him in case he doesn't get into a contract, then in that case it does not amount to coercion. But if someone is falsely accusing and doing a malicious prosecution against another person, then that threat amounts to coercion. Now let us understand the coercion with the help of some illustration. A on board an English ship on the high seas causes B to enter into an agreement by an act amounting to criminal intimidation under IPC. I think you have read in IPC what is criminal intimidation. Means you are actually threatening a person to get into a contract. A afterwards sues B for breach of contract at Calcutta. So in this case, A has employed coercion. Although his act is not an offence by the law of England, and although Section 506 of the IPC was not in force at the time when or place where the act was done. So he actually coerced him in England and then he sued him in Calcutta because he did not perform his contract. But A has actually employed coercion to B so that B would get into the contract, and that was done in England, and IPC is not applicable to England, but it would amount to coercion because it is actually immaterial where and when it was done, right? Now let us move to the second one, that is undue influence. Now undue influence has been defined under section 16 of the Indian Contract Act. So in undue influence, what happens? There is a party who is at a dominant position over another party, and he tries to obtain advantage out of it by influencing. Now there are some relationships like fiduciary relationships, which there a person can employ undue influence, like employer-employee, principal-agent, parents and children. So all these are the cases where undue influence can be employed. So section 16 says that a contract is said to be induced by undue influence where the relations subsisting between the parties are such that one of the parties is in a position to dominate the will of the other and uses that position to obtain an unfair advantage over the other. So two things are essential here. That one is in a dominant position, and the second is he uses that dominant position to obtain an unfair advantage. So in a particular and without prejudice to the generality of the foregoing principle, a person is deemed to be in a position to dominate the will of another, first, where he holds a real or apparent authority over the other, or where he stands in a fiduciary relation to the other. Second, where he makes a contract with a person whose mental capacity is temporarily or permanently affected by reason of age, illness, or mental or bodily distress. Okay, so in this case, there can be what? There can be a dominant position of a person where he can employ undue influence. Now, where a person who is in a position to dominate the will of the another enters into a contract with him and the transaction appears on the face of it or on the evidence adduced to be unconscionable, the burden of proving that such contract was not induced by undue influence shall lie upon the person in a position to dominate the will of the other. So this says that if someone is accusing that his or her consent has been taken by employing undue influence, so the person who is at the dominant position, he has to prove that no, I have not employed any kind of undue influence to get the consent of the person. Okay, so let us understand this with the help of illustrations. So the first one, a man enfeebled by disease or age is induced by B's influence over him as his medical attendant to agree to pay B an unreasonable sum for his professional services. B employs undue influence. So this medical attendant and a patient, they also stand in the same footing as in a fiduciary relationship. So in this case, the person was enfeebled by disease or age, and in this case the medical attendant has actually employed undue influence. Now let us look at another illustration. A, being in debt to B, the money lender of his village, contracts a fresh loan on terms which appears to be unconscionable. It lies on B to prove that the contract was not induced by undue influence, as I've already told. So, if someone is filing a suit by accusing that his or her consent was taken on the basis of by employing undue influence, the burden of proof lies on the person dominating the position, and in this case the money lender was dominating the position, so the onus is upon him to prove that no, he had not induced or he had not induced any kind of undue influence on that person. Now let us understand about fraud. Now fraud is defined under section 17 of the Indian Contract Act. So what does fraud say? Fraud means and includes any of the following acts committed by a party to a contract or with his connivance or by his agent with intent to deceive another party thereto of his agent or to induce him into enter into the contract, the suggestion as a fact of that which is not true by one who does not believe it to be true. Second, the active concealment of a fact by one having knowledge or belief of the fact. Third, a promise made without any intention of performing it. Fourth, any other act fitted to deceive. Fifth, any such act or omission as the law specifically declares to be fraudulent. There is also an explanation that mere silence as to facts likely to affect the willingness of a person to enter into a contract is not fraud unless the circumstances of the case are such that regard being had to them, it is the duty of the person keeping silence to speak, or unless his silence is in itself equivalent to speech. So what happens in fraud? That the person who is employing fraud has the reason to believe that whatever he is saying is actually false. So he is presenting his terms to another person or another party to cause damage to the other party, and he has a ill will or he has an ill intention that if the other person gets into the contract, then this person will gain some kind of advantage. So in this case, a person employs fraud. Now let us look at some illustrations. B says to A, if you do not deny it, I shall assume that the horse is sound. A says nothing. Here, A's silence is equivalent to speech. Okay. Now another illustration is A and B, being traders, enter upon a contract. A has private information of a change in prices which would affect B's willingness to proceed with the contract. A is not bound to inform B. So you may think that yeah, he is doing fraud, but no, it's not fraud, because here it is not important. If you see the explanation, it says that mere silence as to facts likely to affect the willingness of a person to enter into a contract is not fraud. But if the circumstances of the case are such that one needs to open up things about that, in that case it may amount to fraud, but in this case it does not amount to fraud. Let me give you an example that A is having a horse and B is another person who has come to buy the horse from him. So A knows that the horse is not of sound mind. Now A need not reveal it that the horse is of unsound mind, because if he tells him about that the horse is of unsound mind, then he may not buy the horse. But this does not amount to fraud. What will amount to fraud? That if B is a person who is under the age of 18 and he wants to buy the horse, in this case even if he doesn't want to buy the horse but he wants to ride the horse, in that case if A does not let B know that the horse is of unsound mind, then it will actually amount to fraud. Because here there is a duty to speak about this, because the circumstances are such that you have to let know the minor that the horse is not of sound mind. Okay. So with this we come to the end of fraud. Now we move to misrepresentation. Now misrepresentation has been defined under section 18 of the Contract Act, and many people use the term misrepresentation and fraud in a similar manner or in a synonymous manner. But misrepresentation means and includes the positive assertion in a manner and not warranted by the information of the person making it of that which is not true, though he believes it to be true. Now, any breach of duty which without an intent to deceive gains and advantage the person committing it or any one claiming under him by misleading another to his prejudice or to the prejudice of any one claiming under him. Third, causing, however innocently, a party to an agreement to make a mistake as to the substance of the thing which is the subject matter of the agreement. So, what is the main difference in fraud? In fraud, there is always an ill intention to deceive, but in misrepresentation, the person is presenting false representation, is making false representation of the facts, but he himself does not know that whatever he is presenting or whatever he is telling to the other party is false. So in misrepresentation there is no wrong intention, but in fraud there was wrong intention to deceive the person. In this misrepresentation, the party is innocent and has done the act without knowing it. So this is what misrepresentation is. Now we come to the last one, that is mistake, and this is influenced by section 20, 21 and 22. So mistake can be of two types. You can see the chart here. I have made this. See, the mistake can be of two types. There is mistake of fact and mistake of law. Now mistake of law is in section 21, but let us first look at mistake of fact. If mistake of fact is unilateral means if there is mistake of fact only by one party. Out of two parties, only one party is under the mistake of fact. In this case, the contract will be valid. But if the mistake of fact is bilateral, this is in section 20, that both the parties are under mistake of facts. In this case, the mistake will be very important and the contract will be void. Okay. Now let us come to mistake of law. This is in section 21. So if there is mistake of Indian law, the contract is valid, because mistake as to law is no excuse, right? So mistake of Indian law, the contract is still valid. But if there is mistake of foreign law, then it is same as that of mistake of fact, and it will be void, and both the parties are under mistake, so it will be void. So till we bring our next video, keep revising and take care of yourself. Bye bye.